Or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. Welcome to our WSP Snack and Learn webinar on assessing climate risks to commercial enterprises and prioritizing mitigation actions. I'm Emily Wasley. I'm one of the presenters today. And before we kick off today's presentation, we wanted to let you know we have held time for questions at the end of our webinar. If you have questions along the way, though, please write them in the questions box of your GoToWebinar control panel during our presentation, and we'll try our best to address them during our Q&A portion of the webinar. At this point, I'm going to hand it over to Michael Monshine to kick us off. Michael.
Thank you, Emily, and good day, everybody. Again, thank you all for joining us today for our Snack and Learn webinar. My name is Michael Monshine. I have been working on the climate change issue now for about 25 years. And I am Director of Sustainability, Energy, and Climate Change at WSP. We have a business practice that supports some 120 companies, 40 of which are in the Fortune 500, and some 150 projects a year related to sustainability and climate change. I'm fortunate to be joined by two of my esteemed colleagues, Dr. Sue Campbell-Cook and Miss Emily Wasley. And perhaps Sue and Emily, you can introduce yourselves as well.
Thanks, Michael. This is Sue Campbell-Cook. I'm a Senior Project Director in WSP's Sustainability, Energy, and Climate Change Group. My background is in climate science, and my work at WSP focuses on assisting clients in understanding and managing risks and opportunities from climate change. Emily, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Sue. I'm Emily Wasley. I'm a practice leader also on the Sustainability, Energy, and Climate Change team. Sue and I are both based in San Francisco, and my expertise is in climate risk adaptation and resilience. Michael, back to you.
Thank you both. So let's start talking about the climate change impacts that we're facing, the ones that are affecting us now, our clients now as well. You know, sometimes when we talk to our clients in the past, they've said that this is happening too slowly to get leadership attention, that, you know, they're interested in the next quarter or the next 3 quarters. And, you know, climate change may be a 5, 10, 20, 50-year phenomena. But really that has changed dramatically recently. Sadly, we've seen more than 200 people in Germany die during unprecedented flooding. We've seen similar unprecedented flooding in China occurring currently. We've seen hundreds who have died in the Western United States from record-setting and persistent heat in regions that had previously been so temperate as to not have air conditioning. Most of our clients have mature, robust risk management systems, and so they often feel as if they've already got climate risk captured. Unfortunately, they often do not. The models of severe weather events that they use are often backwards looking and insufficiently effective in taking into account chronic storms and sea level rise. Often there are company silos, and those working on the day-to-day operations of the company are insufficiently informed about potential climate risks. Aside from good risk management, there are many other benefits to increasing resilience. Quite often the risks of climate change are driven by activities outside the fence of your company's operations. I think many of us are familiar of this photo from Lower Manhattan in New York City, taken during Superstorm Sandy. A large investment bank had an islanded, resilient electricity supply, and their building, lit up, shone like a beacon in the otherwise dark city. Of course, none of their staff could get to work and occupy that building, and instead of a benefit to their business, that beacon was a millstone around their neck, underscoring the divide between haves and have-nots and compromising their reputation. If instead they had used that islanded power to provide services to the embattled community, they could have greatly enhanced their reputation. Similarly, we know there is an ongoing struggle for talent in the market right now, and a shortage of qualified staff. More and more individuals want to work for purpose-driven companies, including those that contribute to the resilience of their communities. Let's look at some other motivations why we need to get this done now on the next slide. Understanding and managing your climate risk is obviously good business. But whether you like it or not, Your company is going to have to do it. So you might as well get the most out of it. The firms that provide capital that you need to run your business are expecting this climate risk analysis, and are happy to take their money elsewhere if it is not getting done. For most of our clients, BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, together own some 10 to 20% of their stock float. And regulators are now starting to require climate risk disclosure. Representatives of the G7 expressed support for mandatory disclosure. The European Banking Authority has already codified as part of Pillar 3 reporting requirements climate risk disclosure. And in the US, the new chair of the Securities and Exchange Commission has expressed the importance of climate risk disclosure to investors, and the agency has sought public comment on how to design a climate risk disclosure. Fortunately, the G20's Financial Stability Board, as shown on the next slide, which was established in the wake of the 2008-2009 financial crisis, has identified climate risk as a systemic threat to the global financial system and established the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, the TCFD. The TCFD has provided a nice taxonomy of climate risks. There are physical risks, which may be divided into acute, like severe storm events, and chronic, like sea level rise or new temperature norms. There are also transition risks as the world tries to deal with climate change through a number of policy, technology, and market mechanisms. Each of these changes altering the operating environment for your company. And let's not forget that while the impacts of climate change may be severe, there are business opportunities associated with helping to mitigate emissions, remove carbon from the atmosphere, and helping our communities become more resilient. We recognize that clients are at different stages of maturity, and our next slide shows that we meet them where they are and assist them in taking the next steps. In order to do so, we take a phased approach, which allows for continuous improvement and adaptation to the changing climate and future forecasts. We start with an assessment phase, and that is what Sue and Emily will describe to you today. Many companies will have hundreds of assets, and completing a risk analysis for all of them would be prohibitively costly and time-consuming. So we begin with hotspot and scenario analyses, identifying those assets with the highest risk of climate impacts that intersect with high values at risk for those assets. Once those hotspots are identified, we conduct an adaptive capacity and resilience assessment. While inherent risk might be very high, measures may be in place that leave very little residual risk. Finally, we do a materiality assessment. Are the remaining residual risks material to the business? If so, we move on to the planning phase to develop further remediation for those risks. Now I'm going to turn it over to Sue, and we can roll up our sleeves and dig into how we go about doing this.
Thanks, Michael. Sorry about that. Okay. Sorry about the technical difficulties. In this section of the webinar, I'm going to give an overview of how we assess physical and transition climate risks and opportunities, and I'm going to walk through some project examples. As Michael noted, our clients often have global portfolios with thousands of assets, and I'll describe a couple different approaches for understanding where the hotspots are within a large portfolio. Sorry about this. I'm not quite sure what's going on here, but whoops. Just going to go back. Okay. So this slide outlines how we assess physical climate risks and opportunities. Now, climate change impacts are impossible to predict precisely, and we don't know how greenhouse gases in the atmosphere are going to change in the future, or what kind of technological and economic changes will happen. The TCFD framework provides guidance on how to manage this uncertainty as we try to understand climate change impacts on a company's assets and business. The TCFD recommends exploring asset impacts across a range of possible futures using climate change scenarios, sort of indicated by the cartoons up here. A scenario tells a story about a possible future. In the higher emission scenario, greenhouse gases continue to increase through the end of the century. The world continues to rely on fossil fuel, and there's little additional regulation, such as carbon taxes. In this type of scenario, there are large and dangerous changes in the climate, more damaging storms, wildfires and drought, and large rises in sea level. In the other end of the envelope of possible futures, a lower emission scenarios, greenhouse gas emissions are reduced by a transition away from fossil fuels due to greater regulation of carbon. There are still physical impacts from climate change, but they're smaller than in the higher emission scenario. So we take these emission scenarios and they're fed into climate models. The climate models are computer simulations of the atmosphere, the earth, and the ocean. They're similar in a lot of ways to weather forecast models, but they're far more comprehensive in the processes they treat and in their geographic scope. We use publicly available climate model projections that have undergone scientific peer review and are extensively validated against historical data. And there's an example here of some output from a climate model. So the climate models simulate the output of the impact of future changes in greenhouse gases on the climate. And they tell us what changes are expected at the location of each asset in the portfolio for each scenario we're interested in and for whatever time period we're interested in. And so this image shows how a climate model produces simulation results for temperature changes by the end of the century across the entire globe. So consistent with the TCFD framework, we look at a range of acute and chronic hazards for each asset, which are listed here on the lower right-hand part of the slide. Once we know what changes in climate hazards are expected at each asset location, the next step is to determine the impacts of those changes on the asset. So we use damage functions or vulnerability curves to figure out the financial impacts to assets based on the intensity of the hazard at that location. Each hazard can affect an asset through multiple pathways. For example, you might have temperature increases that result in increased cooling costs, shifts in consumer behavior, and decreased employee productivity. So we look at separate damage functions for each asset type. For example, a data center would have different impacts than a retail asset. And then one key thing to note is that these damage functions are determined from empirical research and are not informed by a particular asset's history or adaptation measures. Emily's going to talk about that a little bit more later. But once we understand through the damage functions potential financial impacts, we can look at what the impacts are from climate change on capital expenditures, operating expenditures, revenues, potential business interruptions. So getting to those financial impacts of climate change. We also look at risks and opportunities to a company's assets and business from the transition to a low carbon economy. That's transition risk. Now, as with the physical assessments, we use a scenario analysis approach per the TCFD guidance. And we use energy and economic models to assess future risks and opportunities across different regions and sectors within a company's business. And so on the lower right-hand side, you can see the types of things that we look at in terms of risks and opportunities. And again, this is consistent with the TCFD framework that Michael was describing earlier. As with the physical assessment, once we look at the different risks and opportunities, things like carbon pricing, litigation risk, and so forth, again, we look at damage functions to figure out what the financial impacts are from each of the risks and opportunities that are identified. So now we're going to move to some project examples, really focusing on physical risk. As Michael was saying, we often look at large global asset portfolios as supply chains. So because of cost and time considerations, we need to think about limiting the number of assets that can be evaluated in depth. So one approach that we take is to work with the client at the outset of the project to identify what are their most critical sites, their most business critical sites. Then we do the physical risk assessment on that subset of sites, screen the portfolio to find the sites with the greatest climate hazard exposure. WSP Global recently performed a TCFD-aligned physical and transition risk and opportunity assessment to figure out the impacts of climate change on its business going forward. This map at the bottom of the slide shows WSP's offices, and each one of these dark blue circles represents a number of assets in that region. So over the northeastern US, it says 106. That means there are 106 sites there that needed to be assessed. So what we had to do was narrow that down, and this slide shows how we selected the assets based on the business criticality. So we started with the 500 sites, and we thought about which ones were critical to the business functions. Overall, we thought about the size and square footage, which sites were maybe the flagships or headquarters of their region, which one had highest greenhouse gas or energy or water footprints, and in particular, offices where there have already been climate-related impacts and areas where we're looking to grow. So through that process, we got down to 17 sites where we really focused the rest of the physical assessment and resilience and adaptation measure development. With the idea being that for those critical sites, if we focus on those, the effort will have the greatest impact. So now I'll describe a project where we took a different approach to dealing with a large portfolio. This was a hospitality sector client that has more than 10,000 assets across the world. And in this project, they wanted to understand which of their more than 7,000 US properties are potentially vulnerable to climate change and which regions that they operated in had the highest exposure to climate hazards overall. So in this case, rather than screen at the beginning, we started by evaluating all 7,000 plus assets. And then we did an analysis of regional exposure, which you see here on the picture in the lower left, which shows which states had properties that were most exposed to multiple hazards 10 years from now. You can see hotspots there in California and along the eastern seaboard, and especially in Florida and New York. So once we'd identified the hazards faced by each asset and the most exposed regions, by looking at the hazards that are listed on the right of the slide, we applied the client's business criticality criteria to identify 20 top exposed sites for each of the hazards over there on the right. And then those sites received further assessment of their exposure and their actual sensitivity and vulnerability to the hazards. And Emily's going to talk a little bit about this shortly. And so finally, I just want to give you a sense of how the financial results can look. What you're seeing on this slide are results for an entire company, but the same type of representation could be used for a single asset or a business group within a company. So this is the result of a quantitative analysis, translating the climate hazard exposure into potential losses and gains from climate change. And you can see across the bottom of the slide are listed both physical and transition impacts. And in this case, the risks are greater than the opportunities, but the main opportunities there are, of course, in terms of energy efficiency and benefits from transitioning to renewable sources of energy. So this financial impact information is the starting point for identifying material risks and for preparing climate-related financial disclosures. But a key point to note is that the assessments I've described here evaluated exposure of these assets to physical climate impacts, but didn't account for the site's particular characteristics or any adaptation or resilience measures taken by the asset owners or their surrounding communities. And so this is a really key point. And now I'll turn it over to Emily to discuss this further.
Thank you, Sue. Okay, now we're going to dive into assessing adaptive capacity and overall resilience. If you can go to the next slide, Sue. So our climate scenario analysis, as Sue has mentioned, really looks across full net risk. So Sue walked us through kind of how we assess inherent risk, where we look at exposure and sensitivity. And I'm going to speak a little bit to the adaptive capacity piece. So the way that we have equated net risk is inherent risk minus adaptive capacity. So what does this mean? So the definition of exposure is listed here as well as sensitivity. But for adaptive capacity, that might be something that's new to you. It's really looking at the presence of structural designs, backup or redundant systems, policies and procedures, or other resources to prepare for and mitigate the impact of climate hazard now and into the future. So really, we look at the facility itself and the asset itself. We then also look at the employees that work and operate that asset. We look at a variety of different components within the host community, because a lot of times our clients really depend on local water sources or energy and power for operating their systems and operating their assets. So if they don't understand the resilience or the vulnerabilities of those local energy suppliers or water suppliers, that's going to be an issue. So really adaptive capacity is really looking at the actions that are being taken now and also what are proposed actions that could reduce their overall inherent risk to get to that full net risk equation. So the way that we determine this is through validating our scenario analysis with facility managers, with asset managers on the ground. And we do that through site visits. A lot of times in the past, we've done this during in-person site visits. During COVID, for safety reasons, we conducted them all through virtual site visits, which were almost as effective, but not as effective because we really like to talk with the facility managers one-on-one, because we can learn a lot more than learning from them when they're around all of their colleagues. They tell us a little bit more information about the true sensitivities at the location. So let's go to the next slide, Sue. So I'm going to talk to you through two client examples. One is a Fortune 50 technology company that we work with. And last year, we conducted a quantitative and qualitative climate-related risk and opportunity assessment, financial analysis across 400 of their major assets. And what we did is we looked at a variety of different documents. We looked at their greenhouse gas emission footprint. We looked at their energy usage. We looked at their water usage to really understand where their data centers were really using a lot of resources and depending on a lot of resources for their operations. We also looked at their asset value. We collected information about actions that they're taking to mitigate hazards, whether they be climate related or other, because if they're taking other actions, those can actually provide co-benefits for climate actions. We also looked at, again, their host community resilience and really explored that on our own before we were able to then virtually confirm with them what we had found, update it and validate it with them and in partnership with them to really better understand what's going on with them on the ground. So we discussed and had about, generally we conduct these virtual site visits within 3 or 4 hours. They either had HoloLens technology, which was really neat to see, or they had a laptop or a phone, so we could kind of walk with them through the site and show us how things were being operated, where things were located, were they above sea level, were they below sea level, had they had any issues with flooding or heat waves, asking those key questions. After the site visit, we then qualitatively score adaptive capacity and really work with them to truly understand what their current adaptive capacity is. So the components that we generally look at are the physical operations infrastructure. We look at financial health, their balance sheet, their cash flow. We ask key questions about employee resilience. So do employees feel safe accessing the site during a storm? What are the measures that the company takes to actually ensure safety for employees who are required to be on site to operate the asset effectively? We look again at the host community and see if they have a climate action plan. Do they have anything related to adaptation? Do they have an equity plan? What does that look like? And then we also ask key questions about supply chain. So what materials are needed to actually operate the asset on the ground? We then roll it up to the enterprise level, so we have a better understanding of a holistic picture of adaptive capacity. We have 3 levels of scoring. We have optimized, established, and initial. As you can imagine, optimized is the ideal. For now, the site considers the current and future impacts of climate change in their design, policies, and procedures. Established is more in the middle, where the site has procedures that can only meet current climate hazards. And then the initial is the site has at most preliminary attempts to develop climate resilience or may have business continuity plans in place that account for natural hazards but have not yet updated it to incorporate the climate hazards that we've identified through our analysis. So with this client specifically, we are working actively with their enterprise risk management team, with their business continuity team to really get these BCPs and risk management plans updated to incorporate the future climate hazards and to really test them out through tabletop exercises to make sure that those are the ones, those are the hazards that they can account for, they can prepare for, they can be ready for, and know that some climate hazards also exacerbate other hazards that are perhaps man-made, like cyber attacks. Perhaps there's a heat wave and the power grid goes down and a cyber attack occurs. So those are the type of hazards that you can also incorporate climate considerations into and test through tabletop exercises or full-scale exercises. All right, next slide, Sue. Lastly, this is the hospitality client that Sue mentioned earlier. We are working with them on developing a scorecard for each of their properties. And since we've already assessed their climate exposure, we're now in the process of starting to assess their adaptive capacity. And we've identified for them specifically 4 core areas that are really essential to understanding their true adaptive capacity. And that includes their property, so that's their infrastructure, their assets, their operations, or not, doesn't include operations, but it includes the buildings and the kind of materials that are needed to ensure that the building is safe and secure during extreme weather or changes in climate change over time. Then we look at operations, we look at people, that includes both customers and employees, and then we look at the host community again. And we rate these based on a scoring that's listed here on the left below. So if you have high climate exposure, but you have high adaptive capacity, then you're likely to get an A. We will still be able to suggest some opportunities for improvement. And here on the right, you can see a scorecard, a mock scorecard that we use. So not only do they get their grade, they also get where they can have opportunities for improvement. And really, this is an excellent educational tool for these property managers who may not understand how climate change is going to affect them in the future. They will absolutely know how climate change has affected them today, but having this additional analysis will help them prepare for what's next. It serves also as a validation tool that we can co-design with the property owner to make sure that the company that we're working with is really supporting those property owners to enhance their resilience over time. So let me go to the next slide. That's it for our understanding of assessing adaptive capacity. We wanted to highlight the fact that our work at WSP Global and our work at WSP USA really aligns directly with the Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs, if you're familiar with them. And all of our work is aligned intimately with gender equality, clean water and sanitation, affordable and clean energy, enhancing economic growth and decent work, exploring industry and innovative infrastructure, enhancing sustainable cities and communities, responsible consumption, climate action, life below water and on land, and also partnerships for the goals. So these are all important goals for our work that we align with, and we actively work with our customers also to align with the SDGs and with the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, and really any other standard that fits their business model. So let me stop there and maybe turn it over to Karina and open it up for questions.
Thank you very much for an excellent presentation. We hope that our participants can stay a bit longer for the Q&A. So let's get started. Also, what I wanted to let you know is you can download a copy of this presentation from the handout box. So let me start with the first question. Are these strategies applicable to both small and large companies as they develop initiatives for mitigation?
Michael, would you like to take that one? Michael might be having tech issues, so I can jump in. Yes, they are applicable to both small and large entities. It really depends on what your ultimate objectives are, what your goals are to conduct this type of assessment. Is it driven by investor requests? Is it driven by general curiosity, wanting to be more prepared? And the scale of the effort can be developed with you. So we work with smaller companies that may have more limited resources and limited staff. And we can do a kind of phased approach. We can assess a few assets and then develop a plan. So over time, you can assess all of your assets or look at the portfolio that you manage holistically. But mostly, we do tend to focus on larger companies because they have very complex systems. They have a lot of different assets globally. They have supply chains that are running into issues that need to be more sustainable and resilient. So we do work with both small and large. And honestly, the smaller organizations are at the heart of really where the support is needed. So we also work with our clients, our larger clients, to help support those smaller businesses and suppliers really get up to speed as best they can, because they're essential to the economic workforce.
Excellent. Next question. Hold on a second. We have surprises annually across the world, scenarios that have not happened before. How can we assess or model these?
We're going to let Michael try again. Michael,
yeah,
we're still
Michael,
having trouble hearing you.
Yeah, it's really odd. His mic is on.
I can jump in there again. So this is a common question that we do get, because there are regions that may not have been hit hard by wildfire that are now being affected by wildfires. So a lot of times, if that scenario is not in a climate model, what we can do is we can play out, as I mentioned earlier, in a workshop or a tabletop exercise and play through that scenario with you. We can draft up a future scenario and have those components integrated and really test out your plans to see how they would respond to such an event. We can also do kind of a full-scale exercise where you are on the ground and it's a day full event, and you have people that are essential employees that are needed during a disaster, and you play that out so you can start to be prepared for those events. Sue, do you want to take how we might be able to model that?
Sure. So I think, one approach we take is to look at a wide range of potential scenarios and using a wide range of models. And so through that, we sort of look at an envelope of potential possibilities that could affect that site. So we start there and look at sort of a range of possibilities, and then take that information and then incorporate that into the type of the work that Emily was just describing.
Very good. Let's take a last question. How does the climate risk analysis connect with company policy decisions that may be necessary? Do we help with that?
We absolutely do. And that is the crux of a lot of why the scenario analysis are being driven, is to inform policy, to inform decisions, to inform financial investment decisions. And a lot of times, these scenario analyses do need to be translated in a manner that is appropriate for decision makers on the financial side, on the risk management side, on the HR side, what have you. So once we do these scenario analysis and really look at what future impacts they may face, we tend to work with the C-suite level folks to really relay that information, raise that awareness, and start that process of really exploring their current policies and how those need to be changed to ensure that a company is resilient, is prepared for what's next, and can adapt, honestly, to the changing climate and what's going to happen next.
Very good. I think, Michael, if you want to read what Michael was contributing for this question.
Yep, absolutely. I think it's a combination of this question and the last question. So Michael says, we bound with business as usual, high-end scenario. So that's the kind of RCP 8.5, and the most robust mitigation approach in output modeling. And our assessments do include impacts and value at risk. The value at risk really provides a high end of possible risks. And TCFD calls for performance metrics. Usually people think this just means emissions and education, but it should also mean how concentrated are your assets, how redundant are your systems in case you face a black swan event. So that's a really good point in terms of the performance metrics and targets. We're not seeing as many related to adaptation or resilience or risk management, but they're being asked for by the TCFD. So just know that the emissions and the emissions targets or science-based targets that are being set are very important, but so are some resilience targets.
Well, thank you very much, Emily, Sue, and Michael. Thank you to all our participants for joining us today. We're going to wrap up the webinar now. Thank you.